1932. 1933 for 1932 to Messi. 1933 for 1933. 1934 for 1933 to Ronaldo. 1934 for 1934. 35 for 1934 to Ronaldo. 1936 for 1934 to Ronaldo. 1937 for 1934 to Ronaldo. 1938 for 1934 to Ronaldo. 1938 for 1935 to Ronaldo. 1939 for 1935 to Ronaldo. 1939 for 1936 to Ronaldo. 1939 for 1937 to Ronaldo. 1940 for 1937 to Ronaldo. 1941 for 1937 to Ronaldo. 1942 for 1937 to Ronaldo. 1937 to Ronaldo. 1944 for 1937 to Ronaldo. 1944 for 1938 to Ronaldo. 1944 for 1939 to Ronaldo. 1945 for 1939 to Ronaldo. 1946 for 1939 to Ronaldo. 1947 for 1939 to Ronaldo. 1948 for 1939 to Ronaldo. 1939 to Ronaldo. 1949 for 1942 Ronaldo. 1949 for 1941 to Ronaldo. 1950 for 1941 to Ronaldo. 1950 for 1942 to Ronaldo. 1950 for 1943 to Ronaldo. 1950 for 1944 to Ronaldo. 1951 for 1944 to Ronaldo. 1952 for 1944 to Ronaldo. 1945 to Ronaldo. 1952 for 1946 to Ronaldo. 1952 for 1947 to Ronaldo. 1953 1947 to Ronaldo. 1954 for 1947 to Ronaldo. 1954 48 to Ronaldo. 1955 for 1948 to Ronaldo. 1956 for 1948 to Ronaldo. 1956 for 1949 to Ronaldo. 1956 for 1952 Ronaldo. 1957 for 1952 Ronaldo. 1958 for 1952 Ronaldo. 1959 for 1952 Ronaldo. 1960 for 1952 Ronaldo. 1960 for 1951 to Ronaldo. 1960 for 1952 to Ronaldo. 1961 for 1952 to Ronaldo. 1962 1961 for 1953 to Ronaldo. 1954 to Ronaldo. 1962 for 1954 to Ronaldo. 1963 for 1954 to Ronaldo. 1963 for 1955 to Ronaldo. 1963 for 1956 to Ronaldo. 1964 for 1956 to Ronaldo. 1964 for 1957 to Ronaldo. 1964 for 1958 to Ronaldo. 1960 for 1958 to Ronaldo. 1966 for 1958 to Ronaldo. 1967 for 1958 to Ronaldo. 1968 for 1958 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1958 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1959 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1969 for 1961 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1962 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1963 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1964 to Ronaldo. 1970 for 1964 to Ronaldo. 1970 for 1965 to Ronaldo. 1971 for 1965 to Ronaldo. 1972 for 1965 to Ronaldo. 1972 for 1966 to Ronaldo. 1972 for 1967 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1967 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1968 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1969 to Ronaldo. 1974 for 1969 to Ronaldo. 1975 for 1969 to Ronaldo. 1976 for 1969 to Ronaldo. 1977 for 1969 to Ronaldo. 1977 for 1970 to Ronaldo. 1978 for 1970 to Ronaldo. 1978 for 1971 to Ronaldo. 1979 for 1971 to Ronaldo. 1980 for 1971 to Ronaldo. 1980 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1981 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1982 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1983 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1972 Ronaldo. 1984 for 1973 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1974 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1975 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1976 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1977 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1978 to Ronaldo. 1985 for 1978 to Ronaldo. 1986 for 1978 to Ronaldo. 1986 for 1979 to Ronaldo. 1987 for 1979 to Ronaldo. 1988 for 1979 to Ronaldo. 1982 Ronaldo. 1989 for 1982 Ronaldo. 1990 for 1982 Ronaldo. 1991 for 1982 Ronaldo. 1991 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1992 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1993 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1993 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1994 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1994 for 1983 to Ronaldo. 1994 for 1984 to Ronaldo. 1995 for 1984 to Ronaldo. 1995 for 1985 to Ronaldo. 1995 for 1986 to Ronaldo. 1995 1987 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1988 to Ronaldo. 1989 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1989 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1992 Ronaldo. 1997 for 1991 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1992 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1992 to Ronaldo. 1999 for 1992 to Ronaldo. 2000 for 1992 to Ronaldo. 1992 1981 for 1982. 1981 for 1981. 1982 for 1981 to Messi. 1982 for 1982. 1983 for 1982 to Messi. 1984 for 1982 to Messi. 1985 for 1982 to Messi. 1986 for 1982 to Messi. 1987 for 1982 to Messi. 1987 for 1983 to Messi. 1988 for 1983 to Messi. 1989 for 1983 to Messi. 1989 for 1984 to Messi. 1989 for 1985 to Messi. 1989 for 1986 to Messi. 1989 for 1987 to Messi. 1990 for 1987 to Messi. 1991 for 1987 to Messi. 1991 for 1988 to Messi. 1991 for 1989 to Messi. 1991 1991 to 1992 Messi. 92 for 1992 Messi. 1992 for 1991 to Messi. 1993 for 1991 to Messi. 1994 for 1991 to Messi. 1994 for 1992 to Messi. 1995 for 1992 to Messi. 1996 for 1992 to Messi. 1996 for 1993 to Messi. 1996 for 1994 to Messi. 1996 for 1995 to Messi. 1996 for 1996. 1997 for 1996 to Messi. 1997 for 1997. 1998 for 1997 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1998. 9 for 1998 to Ronaldo. 1999 for 1999.
Hello guys, who will win today, Messi or Ronaldo? Guys, comment me guys, who will win today, Messi or Ronaldo? This is the last throw guys. Who will at 2000 point? Who will get 2000 point? This time for Ronaldo win guys.
2000 for 1999 to Ronaldo.
Let's start 30 point match in between Messi and Ronaldo.
1960 for 1960. 1961 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1961 for 1961. 1962 for 1961 to Ronaldo. 1963 for 1961 to Ronaldo. 1963 for 1962 to Ronaldo. 1963 for 1963. 1964 for 1963 to Ronaldo. 1964 for 1964. 1965 64 to Messi. 1966 for 1964 to Messi. 1967 for 1964 to Messi. 1968 for 1964 to Messi. 1969 for 1964 to Messi. 1969 for 1965 to Messi. 1969 for 1966 to Messi. 1969 for 1967 to Messi. 1970 for 1967 to Messi. 1970 for 1968 to Messi. 1971 for 1968 to Messi. 1972 for 1968 to Messi. 1972 for 1969 to Messi. 1972 1970 to Messi. 1972 for 1971 to Messi. 1972 for 1972. 1973 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1974 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1975 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1976 for 1972 to Ronaldo. 1976 for 1973 to Ronaldo. 1976 for 1974 to Ronaldo. 1976 for 1975 to Ronaldo. 1976 for 1976. 1977 for 1976 to Ronaldo. 1978 for 1976 to Ronaldo. 1978 for 1977 to Ronaldo. 1978 for 1978. 1979 for 1978 to Messi. 1979 for 1979. 1980 for 1979 to Ronaldo. 1980 for 1980. 1981 for 1982 Messi. 1982 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1980 1981 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1985 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1986 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1987 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1988 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1989 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1989 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1990 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1990 for 1983 to Ronaldo. 1990 for 1984 to Ronaldo. 1990 for 1985 to Ronaldo. 1991 for 1985 to Ronaldo. 1991 1986 to Ronaldo. 1991 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1992 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1993 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1994 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1994 for 1988 to Ronaldo. 1995 for 1988 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1997 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1998 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1999 to Ronaldo. 1999 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 for 1999 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1988 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1989 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1989 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1992 Ronaldo. 1997 for 1991 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1991 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1992 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1993 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1994 to Ronaldo. 1999 for 1994 to Ronaldo. 1999 for 1995 to Ronaldo. 1999 for 1996 to Ronaldo. 1960 for 1961 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1962 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1963 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1964 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1965 for 1962 Ronaldo. 1965 for 1961 to Ronaldo. 1966 for 1961 to Ronaldo. 1966 for 1962 to Ronaldo. 1967 for 1962 to Ronaldo. 1967 for 1963 to Ronaldo. 1967 for 1964 to Ronaldo. 1967 for 1965 to Ronaldo. 1967 for 1966 to Ronaldo. 1968 for 1966 to Ronaldo. 1969 for 1966 to Ronaldo. 1970 for 1966 to Ronaldo. 1970 for 1967 to Ronaldo. 1971 for 1967 to Ronaldo. 1972 for 1967 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1967 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1968 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1969 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1970 to Ronaldo. 1973 for 1971 to Ronaldo. 1973 for Ronaldo. 1973 for 1973. 1974 for 1973 to Ronaldo. 1974 for 1974. 1974 to Messi. 1976 for 1974 to Messi. 1977 for 1974 to Messi. 1978 for 1974 to Messi. 1979 for 1974 to Messi. 1979 for 1975 to Messi. 1980 for 1975. 1980 for 1976 to Messi. 1980 for 1977 to Messi. 1981 for 1977 to Messi. 1981 for 1978 to Messi. 1981 for 1979 to Messi. 1981 for 1982 Messi. 1981 for 1981. 1981 to Ronaldo. 1983 for 1981 to Ronaldo. 1983 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1984 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1985 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1986 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1987 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1988 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1989 for 1982 to Ronaldo. 1989 for 1983 to Ronaldo. 1990 for 1983 to Ronaldo. 1991 for 1983 to Ronaldo. 1991 for 1984 to Ronaldo. 1992 for 1984 to Ronaldo. 1992 for 1985 to Ronaldo. 1993 for 1985 to Ronaldo. 1993 for 1986 to Ronaldo. 1994 for 1986 to Ronaldo. 1995 for 1986 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1986 to Ronaldo. 1996 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1997 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1998 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 1999 for 1987 to Ronaldo. 2000 for 1987 to Ronaldo.